Well, good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I want to first thank Senator Heitkamp's office for sponsoring this very important meeting to talk about adversity of childhood experiences, a condition that, although this has somehow drifted, and we were talking about this just now, into the popular culture, there's real science behind this. And there's a real urgency. That science informs a real urgency for us to respond, not just through practice, but also policies that can help support the work of adverse childhood experiences. Nearly 44% of children in this country have experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. Let me translate that for you. What does that mean when we talk about adversities experienced in childhood? We're not just talking about physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect. We are also talking about the cumulative traumas that occur living day to day in our conditions of poverty, and how those accumulate and create these multiple stressors, not just for the child, but for the community that the child lives in. And that there's scientific evidence to show what this does to the developing mind. And this panel today is going to help us better understand those words that we hear in the popular culture around adverse childhood experiences, adverse community experiences, and toxic stress. What does that really mean? So our first panelist in discussion will be Elizabeth Pruitt, who is the founding director of the ACEs Connection. This is a national organization that really pulls together the stories that are happening at the ground. What do ACEs look like? Putting a real face to the experience of ACEs, but also how our communities are responding to ACEs. How our communities, how organizations are taking the science of ACEs and translating that into practice, but also more importantly for those assembled here in this room, how we can take that practice and translate that into meaningful policy to help further this work. Also joining us today, in just a moment here, is Zach Kaminsky, who is from Johns Hopkins, and who is going to speak to us about the epigenetics of trauma. So epigenetics, big word, but it has big meaning. What we're talking about is how that intersection between the environment and our genetics, what in our environment turns on or turns off particular genes, how we may be able to understand how that transaction between our genetics and our environment, what occurs, what we may be able to do about that. And again, what the science informs us in practice can also help inform policy. Also joining us is Nathan Fox from the University of Maryland, who will help us better understand the impact of trauma on both the brain and the mind and the body. And this is an important distinction between understanding that the brain science and how that translates into what occurs within our mind and what occurs within our bodies. So today is going to be a really great opportunity for you to better understand the cutting-edge science that we've begun to understand and respect that informs the body of evidence for adverse childhood experiences, its origins from a very small study that occurred at Kaiser Permanente, but was then taken on by the CDC. Before I turn this over to Elizabeth, I do want to let everyone know that at 3 o'clock we are expecting our host, Senator Heitkamp, to come in, and we'll stop wherever we are, allow her to have some very passionate remarks regarding this topic, and then we'll continue. And we will entertain Q&A after all of the speakers have finished. So, Elizabeth, do you want to?
Hop over. I broke a bone in my foot. So anyway, let's see, the clicker. All right. I might need some help here. There we go. And this, let's see. Okay. So I would also like to thank Senator Heitkamp. About a year and a half ago, she did a briefing on trauma in the Native American community. And after the briefing, which included Zach and me and some others, she said that she felt some hope for the first time leaving that hearing room. And I think I'm really hopeful that you will feel the same way, because this is really science that can completely transform how we look at public policy issues and just how we see human development. So I would like to start with a slide. I totally stole it from Jack Shonkoff, who is really one of the leaders in this field. He's a physician and a scientist and really knows more about toxic stress than almost anybody. But he laid out this framework, and I think it works for both the discussion that we're having today, but also how to think about these terms that are now fortunately being used in sort of, general conversations about policy and how we solve some of the social problems that we have. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study really talks about the risk factors that lead to these lifelong impairments that Wendy mentioned. Toxic stress really gets at why do you have these kinds of health outcomes as the result of experiences. And then the third bucket is trauma-informed care. And that's the ways that interventions are being developed. If we know this is what's happening with a very large part of the population, then we need to look at our systems and talk about how they need to be transformed to acknowledge this new science. This is the ACEs pyramid. It's used by CDC and lots of others. I think it's a good representation of what we're talking about. At the base, we've added to that, and I'll get to that in a minute. We know that adverse childhood experiences is the beginning, and that leads to disrupted neurodevelopment, some of the social and emotional and cognitive impairment problems, adoption of high-risk behaviors, disability, and disease that results from that. But even when there is not these high-risk behaviors such as smoking and drinking, binge drinking, and so forth, you're still seeing a biological impact. And then at the top of the pyramid is early death. And we know that if you have an ACE score of about 6, you are likely to die about 20 years before someone who didn't have a high ACE score. So what we know is that ACEs are, let me go back a second. Oops. No, I don't know how to go back, but let's, yeah. Oh, there we go. Oh, okay. I'm not, could you tell me so you're.
So look up there at previous.
So it need to go back one more. Okay, hopefully I won't have that happen because I'm not sure still what to do. I'm sorry. Oh no, oh no. It's very sensitive. Okay.
Do you want to go back one?
One more. Okay. So what we know about ACEs is that, first of all, that they're very common. Nearly 2/3 of the people who participated in the survey had at least one ACE. There's an unmistakable link between adverse childhood experiences and the onset of chronic disease. 3, the more types of childhood adversity that you have, the more dire the circumstances. 4, if someone is experiencing one type of trauma, they're likely to be experiencing more. And 5, trauma does not necessarily indicate a violent behavior response. Many of the things that fall into the category of ACEs are very sort of ordinary things like divorce, living with someone who's an alcoholic, and then also physical and sexual abuse. Oh, there, I think I was on the wrong side, I'm sorry. So this is a representation of what is explained by ACEs with all of these different problems, disability, depression, etc. This is going back to the pyramid that we saw just a few minutes ago. And if you look at the bottom, we've added a couple of layers that are really, really important. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today will get at some of these. We now know through science that there is a transmission of trauma through the genes. There's also what's called historical trauma. This is something that Senator Heitkamp is very interested in because of the Native American community and, the Native American population and the destruction of their culture and how this impact has really gone from one generation to the next. And then as people looked at the original 10 indicators of the ACE study, it became increasingly clear that there were others, such as living in a community where there's violence, even if there's not violence in your home, if there's violence in the community, and also poverty. Today, there are just about 50% of all children are living either in poverty or near poverty, and that is a condition that is in itself an adverse experience. So this is just a quick rundown of the 10 original survey questions that the types of ACEs. You can see the usual ones of neglect and abuse, and then there's the household functions, such as living with someone who has a mental illness or a substance abuse problem, a person who has a parent who is incarcerated, that's a major ACE, and then losing a parent through divorce or some other reason such as death. So you can see by this that adverse childhood experiences are extremely common, especially when, if you just look at the general population. And I would like to note that the ACE study was originally done by almost largely a Caucasian population, people who were insured, people who had relatively good jobs that provided health insurance. So you're really looking at, across the board population, just your average person. But when you get into some of the subsets of people that access the social services system, for example, you'll find that you'll have much higher ACE scores. Children who are in foster care, for example. So what does this mean if you have a high ACE score? Well, it's very likely that your chance of depression is much, much higher. You can see if your ACE score is 4 or more, you are likely to be depressed at a 60% rate for men and sort of a little bit above that for women. So it's a huge risk factor for depression. It's also a risk factor for both perpetuating domestic violence and being a victim of domestic violence. Based on the ACE study, 16% of men and 25% of women, remember this is a very homogeneous population, experienced sexual abuse before the age of 18. So it's also a risk factor for alcoholism. You can see if you have an ACE score of 4 or more, 16% of that population is an alcoholic. It also has implications for unemployment and just disability, not being able to work at all. So the original ACE study came out in 1998, but since that time, states have done a ACEs module that it's in a study called the BRFIS, Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. But 32 states in the District of Columbia have included this module into what they're asking. So we have a huge body of information, and lots of other studies have been done. The Crittenden Foundation, NIH has supported surveys. They're looking at different things. Something recently came out that looked at the effectiveness of antidepressants if a person has suffered trauma, and found that they're not effective. So the data is growing and growing. This slide really gives you sort of the idea of what we're talking about in terms of, we're really not talking about stress that's just inevitable part of living. You know, you break your leg, then you have to walk around in crutches, that sort of thing. It's beyond tolerable stress. This is when you have a stressful event, but you have sort of people around you that can help you through it. What we're really talking about is toxic stress, and our panelists today will really get into that more specifically. And I alluded to the fact that, I'm sorry, I'm afraid to move that again, when you get into child and adult serving systems, if I could go back, you'll see that whatever the system, whether it's the foster care system or the juvenile justice system, things like that, the incidence of trauma is enormous. All of those numbers were about 90+%. So what do we do about it? And I know this is going to be part of one of the future briefings that are being planned by Senator Heitkamp's office. So I urge you to come back, because I've laid out kind of some of the problems that result because of ACEs, but there are lots and lots of solutions that are being tried both at the local level and with federal support and other support. Communities are coming together. And one of the best examples was the Walla Walla, Washington, Lincoln High School. And this has kind of gone viral. Jamie Redford, Robert Redford's son, has done a film about documenting this school and how they turned it around. And they not only reduced suspensions and expulsions, but they also raised the academics. Pediatricians are using it in their offices. They're starting to ask, what kind of experiences did you have in childhood? And they know that if parents have had experiences, in all likelihood, their children do as well. So, see, I'm not touching this, and it's just moving, moving along. I'm breathing on it, but I don't know how to reverse it, so.
It's okay. Oops.
There we go.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll try. So in addition to pediatricians and schools, we're also seeing new trauma-informed approaches in courts. And one example is something called the Safe Baby Court. And instead of removing children from a person's family, they work with the family to provide wraparound services so that the parents can be more effective parents. And it's also, it has a mind of its own. I'll just sort of quickly try to cover these things. And you've got things on, you've got the handouts.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Here.
Okay. Am I touching in the wrong place, or?
I don't know. I'm not checking.
All right. So one example is something we just wrote about in ACEs Connection, which I hope everybody will look at and join if they're really interested in this topic. There's programs all over the country to help parents be more effective parents, and once they've learned about the ACEs science, a light bulb goes off. They realize that the experiences that they have, they are in some way transmitting it to their children. And once they know that they're doing that and that there's an alternative, with coaching, they're able to do a lot better job and heal themselves. So I'm still having trouble with the slides. What I'd like to, I'll just mention one other program, which is the Nurse Family Partnership. And this is a program that's received federal support for quite a while under the ACA. And it's a very intensive program where nurses come into the home and help parents in all of the aspects of parenting. And now this is a good example of the ACEs research. There's a toolkit called Near at Home, and it incorporates this understanding of ACEs and really makes the program even more effective than it was prior to that. And then I'd like to finish with a quote that Megan will bring up. And this, again, is Jack Shonkoff from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. And this is an outstanding website, too, for information. But he talks about the consequences of toxic stress being causing the most expensive problems in our society: prisons, economic dependence, people who are not able to work, people who aren't healthy. The cost to the healthcare system is quite remarkable. And he concludes by saying it's not only a moral imperative, but it is also has huge financial cost implications. And more states, a recent example in Tennessee, where the governor and others in the state government are recognizing that if they want to control healthcare costs, improve children's performance in schools, and just move things forward, that this science has a lot to offer. So I'll end with that, and I hope my leg, which is feeling a little asleep, I'll hold on. I'm good.
So thank you, Elizabeth. I think what Elizabeth did is really set us up nicely to talk about that bridge between what happens in the clinical environment and what happens in the community environment. And Nathan's talk will help us better understand why it's so important that we do create that bridge, because what we see that occurs from a clinical aspect has to be addressed in community, and helping us better understand the science behind that. Nathan, if you could join us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So first, thanks to Senator Heitkamp for inviting us to be here this afternoon. I'm going to, because Elizabeth did such a great job on the ACEs study, all of my PowerPoint slides on ACEs I'm just going to whiz through. But what I am going to do is give you a bit of context for what I'm going to be talking about. About 18 years ago, there was a White House conference on early childhood and the brain. Some of you may remember that there was a Newsweek cover about the importance of the first weeks and months of life. The president of the McDonald Foundation, John Brewer, in St. Louis, wrote a book called The Myth of the First 3 Years of Life, in which he took to task neuroscientists and psychologists and educators to ask what the data are to say that, in fact, the first months, years of life are so important for brain development. The MacArthur Foundation organized a working group called Early Experience in Brain Development. I was part of that working group, as was Jack Shonkoff. And from that working group, about 11 years ago, Jack formed the National Scientific Council for the Developing Child, which I am the co-director, scientific co-director of that group. The story that I'm going to tell you today is what we came to call the core story of understanding principles of brain development and the importance of early experience and the importance of the first years of life. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about the impact of trauma on the brain, principles of brain development, and then implications for policy. Okay, so the first thing to say is that we know from the neuroscience that toxic stress, Elizabeth talked about toxic stress in her talk, changes brain architecture. And in fact, we can see very clearly, microscopically, how toxic stress can affect neurons and their development. And you can see there typical neurons in terms of those buds, which are the synaptic connections, and you can see the damaged neurons with fewer connections for an animal that has undergone toxic stress. This is work that we've done in Bucharest, Romania, with children who were institutionalized. And you can see here the differences in brain activity between those children who are living in an institution and those children who are from the community. The red means that you're showing brain power. The absence of red in the institutionalized children means that those children who are undergoing psychosocial neglect, that their brains are not putting out as much energy as children who are coming from the community. So what are the core principles of brain development that we've come up with? The first is that brains are built over time. The second is the importance of positive relationships that are integral for healthy brain development. The third, and importantly, is that brain development does not end at age 3, and important changes occur in the preschool period, and indeed also through adolescence. And as you heard in Elizabeth's talk, toxic stress can derail brain development in infancy and beyond. And finally, neglect is the most common form of maltreatment for children in the United States, and I think it's important that we recognize that, but that positive support and responsive relationships can buffer toxic stress. Okay, so principle number 1, brain architecture supports lifelong learning, behavior, and development. Brains are built over time. So, starting, if you think about it as a house, when we talk about brain architecture, simple skills come first, more complex skills come afterwards. If you are an architect and you're designing a house, you start with the foundation, then you start with the walls, and you do the wiring. That's the way the brain is built. It starts with the very basic foundation, and then the wiring occurs over time. Cognitive, emotional, and social capabilities are inextricably intertwined throughout the life course, and a strong foundation in the early years improves the odds for positive outcomes, and a weak foundation increases the odds of later difficulties. I am going to pause right there. No.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to see you all here. We started this project really as a result of an Indian Affairs committee hearing that we had, where we started talking about toxic stress. We started talking about what seemed to be epidemics in this country, whether it's opioid, whether it's children failing out of the education system. I mean, you look at every place where we saw pockets of poverty, we saw problems that seemed almost insurmountable and seemed to be multiplying, despite, you know, billions of dollars of investment in trying to change outcomes. And so I'm someone who, when I'm confronted with this level of challenge, I think, what is going on? I mean, what really is going on in America? Why is this happening? And when you really start looking at the science and you really start looking at what you're going to hear about today, you really start realizing that a lot of what we do in Washington, D.C., and a lot of what we do in healthcare, and a lot of what we do across the country in confronting these problems is we treat symptoms. We treat symptoms. We try and get counseling for addiction, you know, and I'm not taking any of that away. We try and figure out employment opportunities. We try and figure out how we're going to better calibrate special education so that we have better outcomes. We start looking at what environmentally is happening. And when you start really thinking about what's happening in America and what the challenges are, you come down to almost taking these macro problems that we see, and they're all in the statistics that we witness every day, and realizing that they represent a micro change in opportunity because of the effects of trauma. And then you start looking at the great work that's being done across America on understanding what adverse childhood experiences mean in terms of even longevity rates. And think about that. There is a theory that a child with 4 incidences of adverse childhood experiences has a 20-year lower life expectancy than a child without those adverse childhood experiences. And the corollary between what we know affects people's lives and how we begin to address actual changes starts emerging. And you start thinking, what are we doing now that we should be doing differently? How should we think about this problem differently? And the science is way ahead of us, I think, in terms of public policy. And so I think the first thing that we need to do, and I want to thank both Clint and Megan for kind of helping pull together a group of senators. I've been preaching about trauma with my colleagues now for over a year and a half, talking about how we need to get to the heart of this and how we need to really begin to make informed decisions here in Washington, D.C. on public policy that is informed by what we know about the science of trauma and what we know about the science of adverse childhood experiences. And so I'm not saying we're here to lead a revolution, but we are here to respect the science. And we are here to say, if we keep doing what we've always been doing, making the investments the same way that we've always made the investments, and expect a different outcome in America, we might be the most foolish people in America. And so the first step is always education. The first step is exposure to the data, exposure to the information. And I learn every day. I have sent this information off to people like Penny Pritzker, who used to be on the school board in Chicago, and talking about changing outcomes and talking about the work the Menominee did in terms of trauma-informed and trauma-based treatments very early on in their education system, which led to ultimately over a period of time a doubling of the high school graduation rates. Showing that if we pay attention to this, the work that's being done in the DC school districts, the work that's being done really across America within the medical arena, whether it's pediatricians or whether it is nurse practitioners or whether it is just exposing the people at Head Start program on how do you greet a child? How do you change that outcome? We have a trauma treatment program in Grand Forks at our community violence intervention program, where the children who have witnessed family violence are immediately given treatment for trauma. It's changed outcomes. And so you kind of become almost a zealot, almost in the army of trying to get people to understand that we need to rethink how we do things and that we need to bring these new concepts into our decision-making in Washington, D.C. on public policy. And so you're all here, hopefully, to take that first step with us, which is to become informed, to listen to the experts who can tell you far better than I can, but then hopefully to become advocates and think about what is it that I've learned today that changes how I look at problems that I deal with for my bosses or for the organizations that I represent. And you think about that. How does this information recalibrate my public policy? How does it change what I think might be an opportunity where we haven't had an opportunity? And so what I want to say about this information and what I want to say about knowledge about trauma and knowledge about adverse childhood experiences is with that knowledge, you realize it's not a terminal sentence. It doesn't have to be terminal. It doesn't have to be your forever outcome. And so this change can lead to so much hope. People ask me why I'm hopeful about changing outcomes for kids who live in poverty, why I'm hopeful for changing outcomes for children who have witnessed violence or children who have been abandoned or children who have had maybe some of the worst exposure to physical and sexual abuse that you can possibly imagine. Why can you be hopeful? Because we know that there's science and that we can apply these techniques. We can apply the kind of interventions that we need to help people recover from the worst amount of trauma in their lives. Now, we need to prevent the conditions that create trauma. That's our long-term prevention strategy. But we also need to figure out how we look at the programs that we fund, how we look at how we approach children in school, how we approach children in the doctor's office, how we educate ourselves on what's happening with trauma. And then what does that change mean for us in a very macro sense? I'm going to close with just one story, and it's a story where people who may not have had all this science and all this data and all this information, you know, where they already come to this conclusion. Because they just, it's inescapable if you do this work. And it's a story about a great friend of mine, a guy named Winston Satrin. Winston Satrin was the warden at the North Dakota Penitentiary. He and I traveled the state when I was Attorney General, all around the state. And I always loved being with him at coffee shops or whatever, because inevitably we would be approached by someone who would, you know, say, "Hi, how are you doing? Remember me?" And he'd say, "Yeah, I remember you. How's your daughter? Or how's this? Or how's that in your life?" And then I would kind of be a little, you know, like, man, he knows a lot of people. And they'd walk away and he would say, "They're a graduate." What he meant is that he knew them as inmates in the penitentiary. Winston did something very few wardens get to do. We could do it in North Dakota because we didn't have at that time a large prison population. He interviewed every prisoner who came to the penitentiary. And he would sit down and he'd say, "Tell me about your life." It's usually how he introduced, you know, the dialogue. And then they would go through, and this happened, that happened. He goes, "No, tell me about when you were a kid." And he said, you know, if they said, "Well, I was sexually abused by my uncle when I was 8, he would write 8 in his folder. Because in his mind, that's how old that prisoner was. Frozen in time, emotionally stunted for the rest of their life without treatment for what happened with that traumatic event in their life. And he did this. He didn't have all of this great information. He didn't have all of this great science. But he knew from years of working with the prison population, the vast majority of them who have experienced horrific trauma as children, he knew that there was something going on that really prevented them from being successful. And that it was only those rare cases that could really escape that beginning life without understanding and appreciation and challenges. And so where you're here to hopefully get educated, a lot of you seem to be nodding your heads, so you're probably in the Army already on working to build support for trauma-informed and trauma-based treatment programs and awareness about this issue. Every step that we take and every person that we put into this effort, that we bring into this effort by talking about it, by educating on, by becoming educated ourselves, and by getting the right kind of education, which is why you shouldn't listen to me, you should listen to these experts. Every time we're able to do that, we can change an outcome. I have a story that I tell a lot about being AG. I was 2 years into it. And, you know, the National Association of Attorneys General, otherwise called the National Association of Aspiring Governors. You know, every 2 years we would get together, and the first 2 years that I was Attorney General, I came and met with my colleagues, and we sat around a room, and they'd say, "What have you done? What have you done, Attorney General of Massachusetts?" And he would say, "Well, you know, I did habeas corpus reform, and I, reformed the juvenile justice system, and I did this and I did that." And I kind of listening, I think, well, I kind of worked on those things, but I didn't do them. And so it got to the end, and I was the last person to speak, and I said, well, I worked on all those issues. I said, but, the thing that I can tell you that I did is I got an 80 or 90-year-old guy back his teeth. They all kind of looked at me like she fell off the pumpkin patch. She's just like, this crazy woman from North Dakota who we don't get. And then I said, I worked on all these issues, and they're all important, and we do them with a lot of professional and colleagues and staff, and, it's part of what we do. I said, but couple days ago, before I came here, I got a phone call. It was at noon, and so there wasn't anyone at the front desk, so I didn't like ring, and so I picked it up. So I actually handled this phone call on my own. And it was a 90-some-year-old guy, cranky, absolutely cranky. And he was mad at the dentist, and the dentist wouldn't give him his dentures. So he and the dentist were in a fight, and he thought it was the job of the North Dakota Attorney General to get him back his dentures. Of course, it wasn't my job to get him back his dentures. But I said, you know, look, we'll see what we can do. So I brought in my trusty Deputy Rosie, and I said, can you just call the dentist? And I said, you tell the dentist that this guy is really crabby, and we really get it. We really get why you don't like him. I mean, trust me, I spent half an hour on the phone. I know why no one would like this guy. But I said, he's 90-some years old, and he's a veteran. And could you just give him back his teeth as a favor to me? So she called him up, and the dentist said, you know, he just needed validation. This guy's cranky. And so he gave him back his teeth. So I told this story, and I said, you know, the one thing we need to remember is we all work on really big issues. But at the end of the day, if working on those really big issues doesn't have any human impact, it's kind of worthless. And I am convinced that more than anything else that I can do in this town is to spread the word about making sure that children get trauma treatment, making sure that we have trauma-informed programs, making sure that we understand this as a public health crisis can have huge macro results for us economically, but equally important, can change the life of just a few people in this country, which is why we're all here. So thank you for letting me come. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. Keep preaching. Keep preaching. Really important stuff. Now I got to go back to my committee.
I want to thank you again, Senator Heitkamp, for all of the cheerleading that you're doing both here in the Senate and as well as in the House. I want to just touch on something that she said before, because we are talking so much about the science of ACEs. I want to give you a face of ACEs. I personally have an ACEs score of 8. You wouldn't guess that. I tell you this not because I want you to have some particular sensitivity about me and my personal story, but I can tell you I know of other Wendy's who have an 8 as an ACEs score that aren't standing in this room today, articulate, educated, passionate about this cause. So I know from a personal experience the science that informs it. By the time the ACEs study came out, I was a young adult. And everyone who raised me already knew what was going on and knew also the science of resilience. So I want us to balance this science behind the ACEs to understand there is resilience. There is something that we can do. There's real hope and there's real power behind the resilience part of the narrative. So go ahead, Neil.
So just focus on that last statement there. Strong foundation in the early years improves the odds for positive outcomes, and a weak foundation increases the odds of later difficulties. Here's a graph that I love to show. Here's the ability to change brains over time. And what you see there is that plasticity, brain plasticity, decreases significantly over time. Here's the effort that is necessary in order to enhance neural connections. So what's obvious from this figure? It's obvious that early on, plasticity is greatest, and the effort that is necessary in order to learn and to enhance neural connections is least early on in life. Here's another figure from the Neurons to Neighborhood book, in which you can see here that brain changes occur not uniformly across the brain, but differently for different types of functions. So sensory and visual pathways early in life, language next, and then higher cognitive function still changing through adolescence. And you can see here what the changes are that are going on in the first year of life, so that early is obviously quite important. How does brain architecture change? So here's a slice of the brain early in life at birth, and you can see here the neurons. This is what it looks like at age 6, and this is what it looks like at age 14. And what you can see here is that there's a proliferation of neurons that occurs early in life, And then some of those neurons disappear. Neuroscientists are like gardeners. They call that blooming and then pruning. Those neuron connections which are unnecessary after learning, they get pruned away over time. Second brain principle, serve and return builds brains and skills. Young children naturally reach out for interaction through babbling, facial expression, gestures, and adults respond in kind. Serve and return is essential for healthy development of brain circuits and the systems that support the quality of relationships in early care settings, whether they be in daycare or in the family, in communities, in the home, they support healthy brain architecture. And we know that from a study that's about 21 years old now that shows that children's vocabulary is a function of the kind of input that they get in the early years of life. Now, that third principle is that brain development doesn't change or doesn't stop in the first year, 2, or 3 of life. And we know that because of the air traffic control system in the brain, a group of skills called executive functioning, which is a key function for school readiness. What are executive functions? Inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. The ability to plan and think ahead is important for school readiness for children. What do we know about the development of executive functions? So you can see here, and this occurs in the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that there are 2 parts that are increases. One is in the preschool period between 3 and 5 years, and the other is in adolescence. And I've got 3 minutes. Okay, so let me finish by saying that we've got 3 levels of stress: positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. When we tried to think about how we would categorize different types of stress, because everybody says, oh yeah, I lead a stressed out life. I'm working for the senator, I'm working for the congressman, I'm working 12 hours a day, that's a stressed out life. That's not the kind of stress that we're talking about in terms of toxic stress. Toxic stress is prolonged, and it is in the absence of supportive and protective relationships. And we know that toxic stress is important in terms of causing significant changes in brain architecture. It's when the body's stress system is activated excessively and it weakens brain architecture. We know that in terms of the security of attachment, and we know that in terms of foster care. So you can see here is that without therapeutic foster care, kids that are in standard foster care are more likely to endure toxic stress. And I'm just going to, is there a way that I can, you can click me so that I can see, because I only have a short period of time. So here are the sources of toxic stress: maltreatment, postpartum depression, and parental stress abuse. And here are the ACEs data. I just want to whip through them because you know that. More ACEs that you have, the more risk you are for alcoholism, illicit drugs, and adverse childhood experiences associated with mental health problems. We know that. But let me end with this figure here. We at the National Scientific Council for the Developing Child are interested in thinking about ways to deal with toxic stress and trauma. And our vision is that trauma-informed care is necessary and important in terms of ameliorating that system of ACEs, toxic stress, and poor life outcomes. And so let me just highlight for you what we mean by trauma-informed care. We mean developing safety, trustworthiness, transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality of empowerment, and cultural and gender issues which allow a community to support individuals within that community. That framework in which we allow ourselves to engage each other as a community will allow us to reduce toxic stress. Now, is there a way that I can get to my very last slide here? Okay, good. This is just to show you that neglect is the most, but I am being, let me just go through here. Okay? Okay, here we go. So if we're going to design a framework that balances enhanced prevention and protection, we have to address the sources of toxic stress. We have to understand the significant adversity derails development, and that supportive relationships, stimulating experience, and health-promoting environments are what we should be looking for. So you all work in the nation's capital and are involved in public policy, and here are my 3 messages for you. As a neuroscientist, translating the neuroscience for public policy, we need to increase public awareness and professional training for personnel in health services, early care, education, and child welfare. We need to coordinate efforts across sectors to identify vulnerable children and families as early as possible to improve access to services. And we need to develop more effective prevention programs in coordination with specialized services to address co-occurring medical, economic, and social needs. Any single point in that is not going to be enough. We need a coordinated effort across that in order to deal with this notion of trauma and this issue of trauma that faces our country. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fox. And you all have his slides. I want you to look at that trauma-informed care slide where he has those various elements of trauma-informed care, and think of those as the protective factors that we are looking for that help build and buffer against stress. Dr. Shonkoff has a very informative video on his website that talks about how we build those protective factors and thinking about how we can, through policy, help to support those types of programs to support trauma-informed care as well as those protective factors in the community are extremely important.
So I'd say that that website right there,
yeah.
Developing Child at Harvard.edu, would be a great website for you to go to get all of that.
Yes. Thank you very much. So we're really running short on time. I do not want to short Dr. Kaminsky at all, so please come forward, Dr. Kaminsky.
Do people have to leave hard at 3:30? Should I rush?
I wouldn't rush, but maybe like
Go quickly.
condensed.
Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I would also like to thank Senator Heitkamp for the opportunity to come and talk with you about trauma and epigenetics. Really, we're talking about genes here, and I'll just get right into the story. So we've heard a lot of epidemiological data that, you know, having trauma is bad, but what you may not realize is that it looks like these negative experiences can be inherited. And that's what I'm going to tell you. And what's important about that is that we used to think, oh, what we do, drinking, smoking, how we live our lives, won't affect our kids because the DNA is set. The message of this story is that's actually not the case in what we're finding. So a few quick examples. The Dutch famine winter when mothers were starved for a long period of time. Well, their kids had increased obesity and psychiatric problems. Historical trauma in Native American communities has been shown to be associated with increased suicide rates in offspring. But let's back up. All right, so it looks like these factors may be mediated by what we call epigenetics. But what is that? Well, it's simple. It's the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. Well, that's the way I see it, of course, but I'm biased, I'll admit. So, you know, if you go on Wikipedia, this is the picture that comes up, and what you're really looking at is DNA compaction, how tightly or loosely DNA is wound, and that's mediated by these epigenetic marks. Epi means above genetics. So it's this code that is sequence independent. Things like DNA methylation. So this mark over here is a methyl mark. And DNA is wrapped around these spools called histones. And other epigenetic marks can determine how tightly they're wound. Okay. So really, epigenetics is the light switch of DNA. If you have a lot of methylation, then it's tightly wound. Transcription factors can't gain access. DNA is the blueprint, but you can't make the machines of the cell. No methylation, boom, you get significant gene expression. This RNA will go off and become protein. Protein does the jobs in the cell, and the cells function properly. There's also another aspect that's relevant for epigenetic inheritance, and that's microRNA. So microRNAs can go and block the RNAs that have been made and basically sort of wash them out of the system. It's just another level of interesting control over what our genes are making. So epigenetic factors are critically important for biological processes. If the DNA is identical in your liver and in a neuron in your brain, then why are they different? Well, the answer is that the light switches are on and off in different patterns. Also, here's a nice example, the agouti mouse. These these mice are inbred. They're genetically identical, and yet you can see they have striking phenotypic differences that are attributable purely to DNA methylation or epigenetic effects. They also have different rates of obesity and cancer, interestingly. Okay, so what's important about this is we've got our genes, we've got the environment, and epigenetics really stands at the intersect of the two. The environment can affect the epigenome. So environmental exposures during gestation and later in the postnatal time period, in other words, when you're a kid, can represent the earliest non-genetically mediated source of variation conferring risk. There's also new interesting preconception evidence coming from sperm microRNAs. I'll talk about that briefly because it really talks about what we do now affecting our kids, even if we're not pregnant right now. And it also has implications for dads, okay? So there was this interesting study where they took mice and they stressed them out. And then what they found was that they, had various behavioral changes when they were older. And so did their kids, okay? But that's fine. We've known that for a while. What they then did was they took the microRNA out of the sperm and they inject it into fertilized oocytes. So it's just the microRNA now. What they found was they had the same behavioral phenotype, anxiety, depression in the offspring. They didn't have the same dads, they only had their microRNA, and then were behaviorally the same. Also, if we look at DNA methylation patterns in kids of people who were Holocaust survivors, we see striking differences in stress response genes. Okay, that'll be important later. But let me talk now about the early prenatal time, okay? So essentially, offspring of depressed mothers have increased autism spectrum rates and other various stress response phenotypes. But critically, the stress hormone response genes, the glucocorticoid receptor genes, have differences in their light switches. So maternal cortisol during pregnancy, how stressed a mother is during pregnancy, will cross the placenta in some cases, and it will reprogram the DNA of the baby. This will make the baby more stress sensitive in later life. Okay, so here's a nice piece of data in some of these stress response genes. So we're looking at epigenetic changes to these genes of 13-year-old kids when moms were exposed to one of Canada's worst natural disasters. And basically what we have on the y-axis is the maternal distress score, so how much hardship, lights off, the roof caved in, they didn't have food, a mom experienced, and you see that the DNA methylation is significantly associated in the 13-year-old kids. Okay, now we're going to talk about the influences to kids. Now we're talking about abuse, we're talking about ACEs, early life experiences. Okay. So the Seminal Studies were performed by Michael Meany's group in Montreal, where basically rats were segregated into good moms and bad moms, okay, whether they licked or groomed their pups. And what they found through a lot of work was that a signaling cascade related to a DNA methylation change in the NR3C1 gene, or the glucocorticoid receptor, the GR, the stress hormone receptor gene, okay? And then later, very interestingly, other researchers showed the same effects in humans. So now, not just rodents, but in humans, in the same gene, in the brain, in depressed suicide completers who were abused, okay? So this really suggests that this early life trauma is affecting the DNA methylation of these genes. So I throw this slide up because in the 19th and 20th century, there were sort of forced segregation of Native American children from their parents. And you can imagine how this effect would be influencing not only their behavior, but their epigenetic patterns. There was a study just out this morning on these same genes show different epigenetic effects if you've lived in an institution compared to if you were sort of adopted. So really another piece of evidence to throw on the pile. Okay, so what's the consequence of all this? Well, it's going to be a bad day. We've got school, or a tough day at work, or perhaps headed towards other very stressful situations. We're going to get a normal stress response. Cortisol will flood the system. It will bind the GR, the stress hormone receptor. These glucocorticoids binding the GR will be facilitated by various cofactors into cell nuclei in relevant regions of the brain, which will then institute a negative feedback response. They're going to shut down the stress response. So under normal circumstances, we deal with the stress properly. We need a normal amount of stress when we get up and go to a meeting. But if we've got these epigenetic changes, we may have insufficient copies of the genes that turn off the negative feedback. And what do we see? We see a failure to suppress the stress response. This is what we see as an endophenotype of individuals who are suicidal, individuals who are depressed, okay? They have dysregulated HPA axis and stress response. Okay, so the last question is, why are our genes doing this to us? This doesn't make sense. But actually, it is a perfect function of evolutionary biology. It makes a lot of sense. And that is because back when we were evolving, our ancestors being chased by dinosaurs, that's a joke, of course, you know, so we're living in a high stress environment. What are our kids going to be like to survive? So here's the watering hole, and we're not watching our kids all the time. My 8-year-old will want to go off by himself. And so they'll think, oh, it'll be fine, and maybe they get eaten. But the threat-sensitive child, the anxious child, thinks, oh, I better be careful. They're worried, they're primed, and they live to pass on their genes. Your genes don't care if you live till 30, right? Back when you're a caveman, your genes only care until you're 15, and then you can get eaten. Right? So we need to be anxious. They don't care if we develop mental illness or become suicidal. We just need to pass on our genes. Right? That's how we've evolved. And that's why these marks are like that. And so even NIMH, I'm just pointing out the research domain criteria. We're shifting from thinking about mental illness in terms of symptoms, like Senator Heitkamp was saying, oh, this is, you know, schizophrenia versus depression, and really looking at RDoC, which it conceptualizes mental disorders as dysfunctions in brain systems that bear important adaptive implications, such as threat sensitivity. So just to point out that other government agencies are really thinking about the way we've evolved and how this can be dysregulated. So the very last slide is that in order to break the cycle, so if we think about this, this child being stressed, when that child becomes a mother, they may pass this on through these various mechanisms through the epigenome to the offspring. And so trauma-informed initiatives may be able to break the cycle and lead to better outcomes moving forward. So that's really the end of my talk, and I thank you all for listening.
So thank you for that very abbreviated but informational talk. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay, great. So do we have any questions? I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions since we've kind of already gone over our time here. No questions? I do have a question, particularly for Dr. Kaminsky and for Dr. Fox. When you talk about this science, how do you see this being translated into practice right now? And what would you see ideal for later? And how this audience might be able to help us with bridging from the now to what would be most successful later.
Yeah, so I would say that the most important thing, the message that I wanted to give, is that we need to have interventions and preventions that focus not only on the family but also on the community, and that provide the supports, the economic, the medical, and the social supports to allow people to reduce the stress in their lives so that the epigenetic factors that Dr. Kaminsky was talking about, that cycle can be broken. Training a child or giving an intervention to a child, but then having that child go back to a chaotic environment is not as helpful as changing or influencing that environment itself and creating the supports and the buffers against that kind of stress.
So what you point to there is this mechanism that's necessary to be able to treat both the child and the parent in the context of that. And we have some real barriers, policy barriers, that prevent that from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so policy, this is the issue for the people in the audience here, but the issue is that without those kinds of policy changes that are systemic in terms of allowing there to be greater support to the family and within the community, breaking that cycle of epigenetic negative effects is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, well, really to second that and to point out that, yes, it has to be, you know, a family-based, well-rounded prevention program. It's not my expertise, really, but really, if we're thinking of these effects being transmitted at really any stage of your life, an intervention that focuses not only on the parent, not only on the child, but also the parent and the environment has the best chance of having a maximum impact.
So, Elizabeth, I know that in a lot of your work, you highlight stories and success stories in particular from the community where we're doing this active translation of the science as if we kind of feel like it's coming out of the chute at the same time that we're implementing. But when we talk about trauma-informed care, we are very much talking about these protective factors that we've identified really help to bridge that gap between what a child and a family may be exposed to as well as how they move forward. So can you talk to a few of some of the successes that you've seen at the community level where communities have been able to overcome some of these policy barriers, these program barriers, to be able to build those kind of effective environments for families and children?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of progress in schools across the country. A lot of the work that we do at ACES Connection Network started in California and has gotten a lot of support from the California Endowment and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. But to realize that a child comes to school with perhaps experiences, the night before, where if there's police involvement, that the child's privacy is protected, but that the school is notified. And just acknowledging school personnel, acknowledging that many of the strategies for expulsion and discipline re-traumatize children. And so there's been a real sea change, particularly in schools, but also getting schools sort of in the center of things so that services that the family might need are available, such as food banks or just whatever supports they might need, and using the school as sort of the locus for that.
And that has been successfully launched in some states. I know that Minnesota has been really helpful in that. Delaware has been able to use school-based health centers as really like this locus for being able to bring the services that a child and a family might need to where they're already going to be. Not expecting a family, particularly these families that are under multiple stressors, whether that's pulling together several different jobs, unemployment, underemployment, whatever the issues may be, that we know that children are going to be in school at least 9 months out of the year and 10 months out of the year. So if we already know this is where they're going to be, how about leveraging those health centers that are already there? We're not expecting, and no one here on this panel is recommending that we make this another objective for teachers to do, the mental health care, the restorative care, but that we can use the school system itself as sort of a center for healing of the community, because it's already recognized as a resource for the community. Is that what you've seen also?
And I think one of the major points, and I think we've made it in different ways, is that we, in the social service systems, often services are provided in silos, and there's not the cross-fertilization that's needed for effective programs. And we've seen wonderful things happen when, for example, in Gainesville, a pediatrician got together with the sheriff, and they did maps of where sort of the hot spots were and the difficult social problems, and they came together and joined forces so that they could tackle those things together. But when we work in silos, we're just not going to have the effective outcomes that we really need, and we'll be spending the money. It's not like you're not spending money. It's just to spend money more effectively.
But our policies reinforce those silos. When we have policies that don't allow for this cross-sector partnerships that actually allows agencies to pool money together, that has been one of the learning lessons from the Building Community Resilience project that we also run, is that looking at when you do have those communities, those spotlight communities, where you do have these sectors that are family and child serving that truly want to work together, yet because of accounting regulations and other regulations, they are disincentivized to work across their silos. So those are some of the other lessons that we might want to actually bring more evidence for them to better understand some of those barriers that are truly in the way of us translating this science into true practice. You had a question?
Yeah, I have a question about, obviously, when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, we think about children, but many adults and even seniors have very high ACEs scores, and I'm thinking about seniors who grew up during a tough time in America, and then, it was long before VAWA and a lot of the protections that we have now. So, my grandparents lived a very ruckus life in Arizona, and it was not easy for my grandmother, etc. She's gone, but my mom's now with an ACEs score of, who knows, very high. And as she ages, and her cohort ages, who will also experience lots of, even then additional violence from the ACEs scores, but then probably entered into the relationships where then there was chronic domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera. How do we take this silent and actually shift our treatment for people in a geriatric environment who are experiencing all of these really negative health outcomes. And probably at the bottom of that is this trauma, but the system's not even asking them these questions. I feel like there's this massive disconnect across the age span, and that this impacts our lives across the age span. But we're focused, and thank God we're focused on preventing it, but there's a lifespan with it caring for us. I'm curious, I work at the Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that lifespan approach and what we do for people who have now, are existing with these high ACEs scores, and we know that that's indicative or a predictor of severe health outcomes. What can we do?
Yeah, so you may have read recently there was a study on what factors best predict longevity over the lifespan. And the one factor that came out as most significant across multiple studies was social relationships. And if we have a geriatric, elderly population and who are isolated and who do not have the opportunity to engage with others, whether they be other elderly people or other people from the community at different ages, then we're isolating them to remain with those ACEs that they grew up with. But providing them the message, the science message, the neuroscience message, the stress message is to provide supportive relationships. And supportive relationships are not only for infants and young children, but they're across the lifespan. And in fact, the research shows that longevity and better health is associated with positive relationships. So if we can encourage those kinds of relationships, whether they be cross-age or within age, I think that we would be doing a great service to the population that you described.
Absolutely. I know that we are well over time. Are there any other questions? All of everyone's contact information are on the slides. And if you have any further questions for any of the panelists, certainly you can reach out to them. Thank you very much for your time today. And again, a great thanks to Megan for your support today and helping to organize this, and to Senator Heitkamp's office. Thank you.